The morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains like liquid gold, casting dancing shadows across the worn linoleum floor as Isadora Chen Valdez hummed softly while preparing breakfast. The scent of coffee mingled with the aroma of bacon sizzling in the cast-iron skillet that had belonged to Garrett's grandmother, creating the kind of domestic symphony that had once made her believe in forever. She had risen early, as was her habit, to surprise Garrett with his favorite meal before he left for another day of checking cattle on their 40-acre ranch. The isolation that had once felt romantic now pressed against her like a physical weight, but she pushed the feeling aside, as she always did, focusing instead on the small rituals that gave shape to their life together. The letter was waiting on the kitchen table, where her coffee mug should have been. Her name was written across the envelope in Garrett's familiar scrawl, but something about the formation of the letters, too careful, too deliberate, made her stomach clench. With inexplicable dread, her hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot, the ceramic handle suddenly too slippery in her sweating palms. Inside, a single sheet of white paper bore words that would shatter her world into irreparable fragments. Isadora, I can't do this anymore. The ranch is worthless, just like everything else about this life we've built. The bank is foreclosing next month anyway, so I'm cutting my losses. You're on your own now. Don't try to find me. I'll be somewhere you'll never think to look. The truck, the bank accounts, everything portable, it's all coming with me. Consider it compensation for 8 years of disappointment. There's a serial killer working this area now, targeting women who look just like you. Maybe that will solve both our problems. Don't contact my family. As far as they're concerned, you never existed. Garrett P.S. Check the bedroom. I left you something to remember me by. The coffee mug slipped from her nerveless fingers, exploding against the floor in a symphony of shattering ceramic. Dark liquid spread across the linoleum like spilled blood, seeping into the cracks and crevices that she had spent hours trying to repair over the years. Steam rose from the puddle, carrying with it the bitter scent of betrayal. Isadora's legs gave way, and she crumpled to her knees among the shards, her nightgown soaking up the scalding coffee, the pain of the hot liquid burning through. The thin cotton felt almost merciful compared to the ice spreading through her chest, freezing her lungs and making each breath a conscious struggle. The sound of a diesel engine roaring to life outside cut through her paralysis like a physical blow. Their truck, her truck, their only vehicle, their only connection to the outside world, was pulling away from the house. She scrambled to her feet, nightgown clinging to her legs, and ran through the living room toward the front door. "Garrett!" she screamed, bursting onto the porch in time to see the red pickup disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust and exhaust. "Garrett! Wait!" Her voice echoed across the vast emptiness of the New Mexico desert, swallowed by endless expanses of sagebrush and red rock formations that stretched to every horizon. The silence that followed was absolute. No neighbors for 30 miles in any direction, no cell phone service, no landline because Garrett had disconnected it 3 months ago, claiming they couldn't afford the $60 monthly bill. Her bare feet were still sticky with coffee when she noticed the newspaper clipping taped to the porch railing with deliberate precision. Her blood turned to ice water as she read the headline. Desert killer claims 4th victim. Authorities warn isolated residents to remain vigilant. The photograph showed a woman who could have been Isadora's twin. Same shoulder-length dark hair, same delicate bone structure, same wide brown eyes that had now gone dark forever. According to the article, the victim had been found in an abandoned ranch house 40 miles south, tortured for days before being killed. The killer's signature was becoming clear. He targeted isolated women, particularly those who lived alone or were temporarily alone on remote properties. Below, the article someone had written in red ink Perfect victim type. Enjoy dying alone, you worthless bitch. The handwriting was Garrett's. No, she whispered, then louder, her voice cracking with the strain. No, no, no! The words bounced off the empty landscape and came back to her, transformed, smaller and more desperate with each echo. She stumbled back into the house, her mind reeling with the calculated cruelty of what Garrett had done. This wasn't a spontaneous departure. This was orchestrated destruction. He had waited for news of the serial killer, had planned this moment of maximum terror and helplessness, had timed his abandonment to coincide with her greatest vulnerability. In the bedroom, she found the rest of his message. Every photograph they had ever taken together was gone, leaving only empty frames scattered across the dresser like headstones in a cemetery. The drawers had been emptied of anything valuable. Her grandmother's jewelry, the emergency cash they kept hidden in an old jewelry box, even her birth certificate and social security card. On the mirror above the dresser, written in her own lipstick, her wedding day lipstick saved for special occasions, were the words, "Serial killer's perfect victim. 8 years of practice pretending to love you should win me an Oscar." The cruelty of it stole her breath and sent her to her knees again, this time on the hardwood floor of the bedroom where they had shared a bed for 8 years, where he had held her just 12 hours earlier and whispered that everything would be all right, that the ranch would turn around, that they would weather this rough patch together. She crawled to the closet and found it stripped bare of his clothes, but filled with something else. Dozens of other women's photographs, all bearing a striking resemblance to Isadora. Dark-haired, delicate, trusting. Some were clearly dating profile pictures, others appeared to be surveillance shots taken without the subject's knowledge. All were marked with crude comments in Garrett's handwriting, ratings, degrading observations, plans for manipulation. At the bottom of the pile, she found a folder labeled Insurance Policy that contained detailed notes about her daily routines, her fears, her dependencies. He had been documenting her isolation systematically, noting how completely cut off she was from any support system, how thoroughly he had managed to make her world revolve entirely around him. Isadora clutched the evidence of his long-term deception to her chest and sobbed with a depth of anguish that seemed to come from her very bones. The sounds that emerged from her throat were barely human, keening wails that spoke of betrayal so profound it reached into the ancestral memory of every woman who had ever trusted the wrong man. The sun was setting when she finally stopped, crying, painting the desert in shades of blood and amber that seemed to mock her devastation. She walked through the house like a ghost, taking inventory of her new reality with the methodical precision of someone cataloguing evidence at a crime scene. The pantry held only expired canned goods, tomatoes from 2019, green beans that had turned an alarming shade of brown, peaches that rattled ominously when shaken. A bag of rice showed clear evidence of mouse infestation, with tiny holes chewed through the plastic and droppings scattered among the grains like malevolent confetti. The medicine cabinet had been cleaned out of everything except children's, aspirin and a roll of gauze that had yellowed with age. No prescription medications, no first aid supplies, nothing that might help her survive an injury or illness in this isolated place. The refrigerator hummed ominously, its contents already beginning to spoil in the desert heat. The milk had curdled, filling the kitchen with a sour stench that made her gag. Eggs floated suspiciously when she tested them in a bowl of water, and the leftover casserole from dinner 2 nights ago had developed a fuzzy green coating that looked like something from a horror movie. In the living room, she discovered that Garrett had taken not just the television and electronics, but also the radio, the battery-powered weather alert system, and even the deck of cards they used to play during the long winter evenings. Every book, except a 1987 Farmer's Almanac, had been removed from the shelves, leaving behind only empty spaces and rectangles of unfaded paint that marked where her small library had once lived. The generator that powered the well pump coughed and wheezed when she tried to start it, producing only a few minutes of grudging operation before dying with a mechanical death rattle that echoed across the empty desert. Without it, she would have no running water within a matter of days. As darkness fell, every sound made her jump. The wind through the eaves created a constant chorus of creaks and groans that could easily mask the approach of footsteps. The settling of old wood produced sharp cracks that sounded exactly like door latches being tested by someone moving carefully through the house. When a coyote pack began their evening song somewhere in the hills, their wild voices rising and falling in harmonies that spoke of hunger and hunting, Isadora barricaded herself in the bedroom with a kitchen, knife clutched in her fist and a dresser pushed against the door. Sleep, when it finally came, brought nightmares of shadowy figures circling the house while Garrett's voice whispered from the darkness, telling her over and over that she had never been worth saving, that this ending was what she had always deserved. The second day brought a dawn so beautiful it felt like mockery. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, painted in subtle hues of gold and purple that would have taken her breath away under different circumstances. Now the vastness felt malevolent, a trap designed to swallow her screams and hide her bones from anyone who might eventually come looking. She forced herself to eat half a can of expired peaches for breakfast, gagging on the syrupy sweetness while her stomach cramped with hunger and stress. The expiration date was 18 months old, but starvation seemed more immediate than food poisoning. The house felt different in daylight, smaller but somehow more threatening, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Every room held memories that now felt contaminated by the knowledge of Garrett's deception. The kitchen, where she had made thousands of meals for a man who despised her. The living room, where they had planned a future that he had never intended to share. The bedroom, where she had given her body and heart to someone who saw her as nothing more than practice for whatever came next. She spent the morning conducting a more thorough inventory of her resources, documenting every can of food, every potential tool, every possible asset in her fight for survival. The results were devastating. Enough food for perhaps 2 weeks if she rationed carefully, no reliable source of water once the pressure tank emptied, no means of communication with the outside world, and no transportation across 30 miles of desert to the nearest town. But it was the isolation that terrified her most. Garrett had chosen this location precisely because of its remoteness, its distance from help or interference. Even if she somehow managed to walk to town, a journey that would take at least 2 days across terrain where temperatures could reach 110 degrees, who would believe her story? Who would care about one abandoned woman in a world full of tragedies? The third day brought the first real test of her resolve. A summer thunderstorm rolled across the desert with the fury of an Old Testament plague, turning the sky black and unleashing torrents of rain that overwhelmed the ranch's aging infrastructure. Water poured through not 1, but 3 holes in the roof, creating waterfalls in the living room and transforming the bedroom into a shallow lake. Isadora ran from room to room with every pot and bucket she could find, trying to catch the leaks before they destroyed what little remained of her possessions. The wind howled through gaps in the siding, driving rain horizontally through the house and soaking everything that wasn't already underwater. When lightning struck a transformer somewhere in the distance, the last of her electrical power died with a pop and a shower of sparks from the outlet near the kitchen sink. In the sudden darkness, illuminated only by the strobing lightning outside, she stood ankle-deep in muddy water and finally understood the completeness of her abandonment. The storm raged for 6 hours, during which she huddled in the hallway, the only part of the house where the roof still held, and listened to her former life being systematically destroyed by forces beyond her control. The sound of water dripping into the buckets created a maddening rhythm, plink, 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 like a countdown to disaster. When dawn finally came, she emerged from her refuge to survey the damage. The bedroom was uninhabitable, its floor warped and buckled by standing water. The living room ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving chunks of soggy plaster scattered across furniture that was now too damaged to use. The kitchen floor was littered with debris and covered in a film of mud that had swept in through gaps. In the foundation, this was it. This was how she would die, not at the hands of a serial killer, but from simple exposure and starvation, forgotten by a world that didn't even know she existed. She almost lay down right there in the floodwater, almost let herself sink beneath the surface and drift away from the pain that had become the only constant in her existence. But as she started to lower herself into the murky water, her hand touched something hard beneath the surface. She pulled it up, expecting debris, and found instead an old journal wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from the flood. The leather cover was cracked with age and stained by decades of desert sun, but the pages inside were dry and filled with feminine handwriting that spoke of another woman who had lived in this place long before Garrett had ever set foot on the property. The first entry was dated 1987, March 15th. Moved to the ranch today with such hopes for what we might build here. James says the land is worthless, but I see potential in the way the morning light falls across the eastern pasture, in the natural depression near the cottonwoods that could become a pond with some work. This place wants to be beautiful. It just needs someone to believe in it. Isadora clutched the journal to her chest, and for the first time in 4 days, she didn't feel completely alone. Someone else had stood in this house, had faced the challenges of desert life, had seen possibility where others saw only hardship. She spent the rest of that day reading the journal from cover to cover, learning about Elena Vasquez, the woman who had homesteaded this land with her husband in the 1980s. Elena wrote about the difficulties, failed crops, broken equipment, financial struggles, but also about small victories, the first successful garden, the year they finally got the well-producing clean water, the day their daughter took her first steps across the wooden floors that were now warped and damaged beneath Isadora's feet. April 22nd. Today, I planted tomatoes in the south garden, where the soil is richest and the morning sun will warm them gently. The land here is hard, but it remembers kindness. With enough care, it gives back threefold what you invest. June 8th. The pump failed again today, but James and I managed to fix it with parts salvaged from the old tractor. There's always a solution if you're willing to work, and for it, and aren't too proud to learn from your mistakes. September 14th. Harvested my first real crop today. 60 pounds of tomatoes, more peppers than we can eat, and herbs that fill the whole kitchen with their fragrance. Made salsa using my grandmother's recipe, and thought about how food is really just love made tangible. The entries continued for 3 years, documenting the gradual transformation of the property from struggling homestead to thriving small farm. But they stopped abruptly in 1990, with no explanation for Elena's departure or what had become of the improvements she had worked so hard to create. That night, as Isadora huddled in the only dry corner of the house with Elena's journal in her lap, something moved in the darkness outside. Footsteps, definitely footsteps, circling the house with the patient rhythm of a predator stalking prey. She pressed herself against the wall, kitchen knife in hand, watching shadows pass by the windows. The footsteps were deliberate, methodical, pausing at each potential entry point, as if someone were testing the security of the building. When they stopped directly outside the window nearest to her hiding place, she held her breath until her lungs burned, certain that her thundering heartbeat would give away her location. The footsteps resumed, completing their circuit of the house before fading into the desert silence. But when morning came, she found fresh boot prints in the mud around the porch, too large to be her own, too recent to be Garrett's, too deliberate to be the work of some random hiker. The desert killer had found her. But rather than paralyzing her with fear, the knowledge that she was being hunted sparked something unexpected: anger. White-hot, purifying rage at Garrett for orchestrating this nightmare, at the killer for seeing her as prey, at herself for ever believing that cowering in the corner would save her life. The decision to fight came not with fanfare, but with the simple act of standing up. Isadora rose from her crouch in the corner, looked around the water-damaged house that had become her prison, and made a choice. If she was going to die, it wouldn't be as a victim. She started with Elena's journal, reading not just the daily entries, but studying the detailed notes about water sources, soil composition, and the seasonal patterns that governed life in this harsh landscape. Elena had included hand-drawn maps showing the location of the natural spring that fed the property, the underground root cellar where she had stored preserved foods, and the best locations for various crops based on sun exposure and wind patterns. The spring was her first priority. According to Elena's notes, it lay hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees about a quarter-mile from the house, fed by an underground aquifer that had sustained life in this area for thousands of years. Finding it required following a barely visible deer trail through terrain that offered no shade and tested every muscle in her body. When she finally located the spring, concealed behind a tangle of brush and deadfall that had accumulated over the decades since Elena's departure, she wept with relief at the sight of clear water bubbling up from the rocky ground. It tasted of minerals and hope, cold enough to make her teeth ache and pure enough to wash away the metallic flavor of fear that had coated her mouth for days. The work of clearing a path back to the house and fashioning a water transport system consumed the next week. Using garden hose salvaged from a collapsed shed and every container she could find, buckets, pots, empty cans, even plastic bags, she began the backbreaking task of carrying water to sustain herself while she developed a more permanent solution. Elena's notes mentioned a root cellar behind the house, hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris and overgrown vegetation. Finding it required clearing away brush that had grown into an impenetrable thicket, moving fallen tree limbs that required all her strength to shift, and digging through layers of mud and decomposed leaves with her bare hands until they bled. But when she finally pried open the warped wooden door, she discovered treasures that made the pain worthwhile. Dozens of empty canning jars, preserving equipment that had been protected from the elements, and most importantly, a cache of heirloom seeds in sealed glass containers, tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, herbs, an entire agricultural legacy waiting to be revived. The ground itself presented the next challenge. Decades of neglect had turned Elena's former garden into hard-pan clay that resisted every attempt to break it up. Armed with only a rusty shovel with half a handle and a determination that grew stronger with each blister on her palms, Isadora began the work of soil preparation. The first garden bed took her 2 weeks to complete, during which she lost 12 pounds and gained muscles she'd never known she possessed. The clay fought her every step of the way, requiring her to swing the shovel like a pickaxe to make even the smallest dent in the compacted earth. By the end of each day, her hands were too swollen to grip a fork properly, and her back ached with a deep, bone-deep soreness that made sleep both necessary and nearly impossible. But gradually, the earth began to yield. Mixing in organic matter from the compost pile she discovered behind Elena's root cellar, adding sand from a dry creek bed to improve drainage, she slowly transformed the hostile clay into something that might support plant life. The library in the nearest town might as well have been on Mars, but Eleanor had left behind a treasure trove of agricultural knowledge. books on desert farming, water conservation, organic pest control, and sustainable living practices. Isadora read by candlelight, teaching herself about soil pH and companion planting, about reading weather patterns and preserving food for long-term storage. She learned that desert gardening was not about fighting the environment, but about working with it, timing plantings to coincide with seasonal moisture patterns, choosing varieties that could thrive in extreme heat, creating microclimates that conserved precious water while protecting tender plants from scorching wind. Her first seeds went into the ground on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the desert air carried the first hints of the cooler weather that would make winter farming possible. She watered them carefully with her precious spring water, carried bucket by bucket from the grove, and whispered prayers over each tiny mound of soil. The waiting was agony. Each morning she knelt beside the garden beds, searching for any sign of germination, any proof that her efforts were not futile. The days stretched endlessly, filled with the constant work of hauling water, checking for pests, and protecting the planted areas from the rabbits and ground squirrels that saw her garden as their personal buffet. It was during one of these morning inspections, 3 weeks after planting, that she first saw him, a man working on the fence line that separated her property from the ranch to the north. He was tall and weathered, with graying hair and gentle hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades working with tools and animals. When he noticed her watching, he raised his hand in greeting, and something tight in Isadora's chest loosened for the first time since Garrett had abandoned her. She raised her own hand tentatively, surprised by how much the simple human contact meant after weeks of complete isolation. But she was still too damaged to approach, too afraid to trust. Instead, she watched from a distance as he worked, noting the care he took with each repair, the way he moved with economy and purpose, the gentle way he spoke to the horses that grazed nearby. 3 days later, her first tomato seedling broke through the soil. Isadora knelt beside the tiny green shoot and wept, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming joy of creation. She had made something grow. In this place of abandonment and despair, she had coaxed life from barren ground through nothing more than patience, hard work, and stubborn refusal to give up. The crying lasted for 30 minutes, great heaving sobs that seemed to purge months of fear and hopelessness from her body. When it was over, she felt hollow but clean, like a vessel that had been emptied so it could be filled with something new and better. More seedlings appeared over the following days, peppers pushing through the soil like tiny green flags of victory, bean plants unfurling their first leaves toward the desert sun, herbs spreading their roots into earth that had been barren for decades. Each new sign of life felt like a personal triumph, proof that her faith in the possibility of renewal had not been misplaced. That afternoon, instead of hiding when she saw the man working along their shared fence line, Isadora found herself walking toward the boundary that separated their properties. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her forward despite the fear that still whispered warnings about trusting strangers. "Beautiful day for new growth," he called out, when they were close enough to talk without shouting. His voice was warm honey over gravel, seasoned by years of desert wind and honest work. "First time anything's grown here in years," Isadora replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. When had she stopped being afraid to admit that she didn't have all the answers? Things have a way of coming back when the time is right. He gestured toward her tiny garden with calloused hands that spoke of decades spent coaxing life from difficult ground. "You planning to expand?" "If I can figure out how." The honesty surprised her. She had spent so many years pretending to be stronger than she was, more capable than she felt, that admitting uncertainty felt like stepping naked into public. "I've got some extra fencing materials in my barn," he said casually, as if offering to share precious resources with a stranger was the most natural thing in the world. "And my boy Soren's been looking for a project. He's 8, and convinced he's a master gardener, despite having killed every houseplant I've ever bought him." The name struck her as unusual and beautiful, carrying hints of Scandinavian heritage and strength. Soren, named for his grandfather, my wife's father. The man's smile dimmed slightly, touched by the kind of sadness that spoke. Of loss deeply felt but fully processed. She chose it before she passed. "I'm Matthias, by the way, Matthias Chen." The combination of Asian and Western heritage explained his distinctive features. The weathered face of a rancher, combined with the gentle eyes and precise movements that spoke of different cultural influences. "Isadora," she said, then added without quite knowing why, "I'm alone here." He nodded, as if he had already known, as if her isolation was visible in the way she carried herself or spoke. Alone doesn't have to mean lonely, and it definitely doesn't have to mean helpless. The next morning, she found a box of garden tools by the fence that separated their properties, along with a thermos of coffee that was still warm and a note written in careful handwriting. "Every gardener needs proper equipment. The coffee's from Guatemala. Soren insists it's the only kind worth drinking." And said the tools were well made but clearly used, seasoned by honest work, and maintained with the kind of care that spoke of respect for both function and craftsmanship. The shovel's handle was smooth from years of use, shaped by hands that had gripped it through countless seasons of planting and harvesting. The hoe had been recently sharpened, its blade gleaming with oil that would prevent rust in the desert climate. Isadora ran her fingers over the wooden handles and felt the first real smile cross her face since Garrett had abandoned her. These were not charity. They were the tools of someone who understood that work was its own form of prayer, that the act of coaxing life from difficult ground was both humble and profound. The coffee was a revelation. After weeks of instant coffee made with spring water and heated over a camp stove, the rich, complex flavor of properly roasted beans felt like a benediction. She stood in her garden, holding the warm thermos in both hands, and watched the sun rise over the desert landscape that had slowly been transforming from enemy to ally. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed that felt as natural as the changing seasons. Matthias would work his side of the fence while she worked hers, and they would talk across the barrier about soil conditions and weather patterns, about the challenges of desert farming and the deep satisfaction that came from coaxing abundance from scarcity. Their conversations revealed the depth of his knowledge about this land and its ways. He had been born on the neighboring ranch, had inherited it from his father as his father had inherited it from his grandfather. 3 generations of the Chen family had learned to read the subtle signs that governed life in this harsh landscape. Which plants would thrive in the cooler months, how to conserve water during the inevitable dry spells, when to plant and when to wait for better conditions. Gradually, carefully, she learned his story. His wife, Maria, had died 3 years ago in a car accident on the highway to Albuquerque, struck by a drunk driver while returning from a teacher conference. She had been an elementary school teacher in the nearest town, beloved by her students and respected by the community. Her death had left Matthias to raise 8-year-old Soren alone while maintaining the ranch that had been in his family for nearly a century. He spoke of loss with the quiet acceptance of someone who had grieved fully and emerged on the other side, not broken but deepened, like metal that had been tempered by fire. There was no bitterness in his voice when he talked about Maria, only love, seasoned by the kind of gratitude that comes from having been truly known by another person. She used to say that gardens were like children, he told Isadora one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the desert in impossible shades of gold and crimson. They need the right conditions to grow, but they also need someone to believe in them, even when they're just tiny seedlings that don't look like much. And slowly, carefully, Isadora began to share pieces of her own story. Not the details, those, still cut too deep to expose to daylight, but the broader strokes of abandonment and betrayal, of choosing to stay and fight rather than give up and die. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Matthias said one evening as they watched her. Tomatoes grow fat and heavy on their vines. It's deciding that something else is more important than the fear. What if you don't know what that something else is? Isadora asked. Matthias was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same care he brought to everything else. Then you start with the next thing in front of you. Water the plants, fix the fence, make tomorrow's breakfast. Eventually, the bigger purpose reveals itself. Soren appeared one Saturday morning while Isadora was struggling to repair a section of irrigation line that had been damaged by rabbits determined to reach her vegetables. She was cursing softly in both English and Spanish, wrestling with PVC pipe connections that seemed designed to defeat anyone without 3 hands. And the patience of a saint. Dad says you're building a garden, announced a voice behind her. She turned to find a sturdy child with his father's dark hair and eyes that held depths unusual for someone his age. Want help? Before she could answer, he had slipped through a gap in the fence and was examining her work with the serious attention of a master craftsman evaluating an apprentice's efforts. This connection's loose, he observed, pointing to a joint that had been giving her trouble all morning. And you need more pressure relief here or the whole line will blow. When the pump kicks in, under Soren's patient instruction, Isadora learned to properly seal irrigation fittings, to design water distribution systems that wouldn't fail under pressure, and to troubleshoot the inevitable problems that arose when trying to move water efficiently across varied terrain. The child had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that amazed her. But more than that, he had a generous spirit that reminded her why she was fighting to build something beautiful from the ruins of her previous life. He worked with the same careful attention to detail that characterized his father, but with an additional quality of joy that made even the most mundane tasks feel like adventures. Mom always said gardens were like people, Soren told her one afternoon as they transplanted seedlings that had outgrown their starter pots. They need the right conditions to grow, but they also need someone to believe in them, even when they're going through hard times. Isadora's throat tightened at the unconscious echo of what Matthias had told her about his wife's philosophy. Your mom sounds like she was very wise. She was. Soren's voice was matter-of-fact rather than sad, spoken with the acceptance that children sometimes possess in greater measure than adults. Dad says she would have liked you. She always rooted for the underdogs. What made her think, I'm an underdog? Isadora asked, genuinely curious about how this perceptive child saw her. Soren considered the question seriously, his small hands still working to settle soil around the transplanted seedlings. You're starting over in a place where other people gave up. Dad showed me the old foundation stones from the house that used to be here, and the fence posts that are falling down because nobody took care of them. But you're making things grow anyway. That evening, as they worked side by side to install a new section of drip irrigation, Matthias said quietly, he doesn't open up to many people, takes after his mother that way, careful with his trust but generous with his heart once he gives it. He's remarkable, Isadora said, watching Soren adjust a sprinkler head with the precision of a trained engineer. So are you. Matthias's words were simple, but they carried weight that settled into her chest like warm stones. What you're building here, it's not just a garden, it's hope made manifest. Their first harvest was modest by any objective measure. A few dozen tomatoes, some peppers that ranged from sweet to fiery, herbs that filled the air with their fragrance when disturbed by the desert wind. But to Isadora it felt like the greatest abundance the world had ever known. She made salsa from her tomatoes, following a recipe she remembered from her grandmother's kitchen, but adapting it to the ingredients she had available. The peppers added heat and complexity, while the herbs provided layers of flavor that transformed simple vegetables into something approaching art. When she offered a jar to Matthias and Soren, watching them taste her creation with the careful attention of wine critics, their expressions of genuine pleasure felt like the greatest validation she had ever received. "This is restaurant quality," Matthias said after his second spoonful. "Maybe better." "You should sell it," Soren added, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that good things were possible. "People would pay real money for salsa this good." Isadora laughed, but the suggestion planted a seed that began to grow in the fertile ground of her rebuilding confidence. "I don't have a way to get to town to sell anything." "We do," Matthias said simply. "Every Saturday. Farmers' market starts at 7. The idea terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Selling her produce would mean interacting with strangers, exposing her work to judgment, risking rejection and criticism. But it would also mean independence, the possibility of earning money from her own labor, the chance to transform her survival project into something larger and more sustainable. "I'll think about it." She said, which was as close to yes as she was willing to commit at that moment. But that night, as she sat in the kitchen, she had slowly been repairing and improving, eating vegetables she had grown with her own hands and planning the next day's work. She realized that thinking about it wasn't really necessary. The decision had already been made by some deeper part of herself, the part that had chosen to plant seeds in hostile ground and water them with hope. The farmers' market was a sensory assault that left her feeling overwhelmed and exposed after months of desert silence. The vendors' stalls created a maze of colors and smells, fresh bread and roasted coffee, flowers and handmade crafts, the cheerful chaos of human commerce in full swing. Isadora stood beside Matthias's truck, clutching 24 jars of salsa and fighting the urge to retreat back to the safety of her isolated ranch. The crowd seemed enormous, though Soren assured her it was actually quite small compared to markets in larger towns. "Just remember," Matthias said quietly as he helped her set up a small table borrowed from the church. "Everyone here started somewhere. Nobody was born knowing how to sell at farmers' markets." Soren stayed close during the early hours, introducing her to other vendors with the confidence of a natural networker. His easy charm and genuine enthusiasm for her products helped bridge the gap between her shyness and the social expectations of commerce. Her first sale was to an elderly woman who tasted her salsa and immediately bought 3 jars, pressing exact change into Isadora's trembling hands with a smile that spoke of decades of encouraging young entrepreneurs. "This is exceptional, dear," the woman said. "What's your secret?" "Survival," Isadora answered honestly, and the woman nodded as if she understood completely. "The best food always comes from necessity," the woman replied. "When you have to make something work, you find ways to make it better than it has any right to be." By mid-morning, Isadora had found her rhythm. Each sale built her confidence, each compliment reinforced her growing belief that what she was building had value beyond mere personal survival. A restaurant owner from the next town over bought 6 jars and asked if she could supply them regularly. A food blogger took photos and asked permission to write about her artisanal desert condiments. By the end of that first market day, she had sold every jar she'd brought and taken orders for, twice as many. The money wasn't much, barely enough to buy seeds for next season and some basic equipment upgrades. But it represented something infinitely more valuable: proof that what she was building had worth in the wider world. Driving home in Matthias's truck, with Soren chattering excitedly about next week's market and the desert stretching endlessly around them, Isadora felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten the sensation. Contentment mixed with anticipation. The deep satisfaction of work well done, combined with excitement about future possibilities. That night, as she counted and recounted the crumpled bills from her sales, planning how to invest every dollar back into expanding her operation, she realized that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something that might eventually be called thriving. Winter brought challenges that tested every lesson she had learned about desert farming and self-reliance. The cold was brutal, turning her breath to clouds and making the work of maintaining her growing operation nearly impossible some days. The irrigation system required constant attention to prevent freezing, and the plants themselves needed protection from frosts that could kill months of work in a single night. But winter also brought unexpected gifts that would transform her personal survival project into something much larger and more meaningful. The first gift came in the form of Maria Santos, a young mother whose husband had lost his job at the copper mine that had sustained their family for 3 generations. She appeared at Isadora's door one December morning, thin with the kind of careful hunger that spoke of skipping meals so her children could eat, asking if there was any work available. "I heard in town that you were hiring," Maria said, her English careful and precise, shaped by the cadences of someone who had learned it as a second language but wielded it with respect and determination. "I can work hard. I learn fast. I don't need much." Isadora looked at the woman's calloused hands and determined eyes and saw herself 8 months ago, broken but not beaten, looking for a lifeline in a hostile world that seemed designed to swallow people like them without a trace. "I don't have much to offer," Isadora said honestly, because she had learned that false promises were a cruelty that hurt everyone involved. "But what I have, I'll share." Maria moved into the old bunkhouse that Isadora and Matthias had spent weeks renovating, transforming what had been a storage shed into basic but comfortable living space. She proved to be a gifted cook with an intuitive understanding of how to combine flavors, bringing knowledge of traditional Mexican growing and preserving techniques that doubled their winter yield and added entirely new products to their market offerings. More importantly, she brought companionship, someone to share the daily struggles and small victories of building something from nothing, someone who understood both the terror and the exhilaration of starting over with empty hands and a determination to create abundance from scarcity. The second gift arrived in January. Rebecca Wolf, a nurse who had fled an abusive marriage, with her teenage daughter driving a car held together with duct tape and prayers, carrying everything they owned in garbage bags and hoping to find somewhere they could start building a new life. "I heard you help women who are starting." "Over," Rebecca said that first night, standing in Isadora's kitchen with her daughter Emma, silent and watchful beside her. The girl's eyes held the kind of hypervigilance that spoke of too many years spent monitoring adult moods and preparing for violence. "We don't have anywhere else to go." The bunkhouse was crowded with 4 women and 1 teenager, but somehow it felt more like home than the big house had ever been with just her and Garrett. They divided tasks according to their strengths and interests. Maria handled food production and preservation. Rebecca managed the business side of their growing operation. Emma proved to have a gift for marketing and social media, and Isadora oversaw it all with a growing confidence in her ability to lead without dominating. Rebecca brought not just nursing skills, but also a hard-won understanding of financial management and business development. She helped Isadora navigate the legal requirements for food production and sales, taught her about insurance and liability, and introduced concepts like profit margins and reinvestment strategies that transformed their informal operation into a legitimate business. Emma, despite being only 16, possessed an intuitive understanding of digital marketing that left the older women amazed. She created a website that showcased their products with professional quality photography, managed social media accounts that attracted customers from across the Southwest, and developed email marketing campaigns that turned one-time buyers into loyal customers who eagerly awaited each season's offerings. "It's all about storytelling," Emma explained one evening as she worked on updating their Facebook page. "People don't just buy salsa. They buy the story of the women who made it, the dreams that went into growing the ingredients, the hope that something beautiful can come from terrible circumstances." By spring, they had expanded from vegetables and basic preserves to an entire line of artisanal products, hot sauces that ranged from mild to weapons-grade, pickled vegetables that added brightness to winter meals, herb blends that transformed simple dishes into restaurant-quality experiences, and jams made from desert fruits that most people didn't even know were edible. Their customer base had grown from a handful of farmers market shoppers to include 3 restaurants that featured their products on their menus, 2 specialty food stores that couldn't keep their items in stock, and a mail-order business that shipped their creations to customers across the country. What had started as one woman's desperate fight for survival had become a thriving business that employed 4 women, supported 5 people, and provided inspiration for other women who found themselves starting over from nothing. The success brought recognition that felt both validating and slightly surreal to someone who had been abandoned to die alone in the desert less than a year earlier. A reporter from the regional newspaper wrote a feature story about their operation, calling it Desert Bloom, How One Woman's Garden Grew into a Community of Hope. The article included photographs of Isadora working in the gardens she had carved from hostile ground, of the 4 women collaborating in the commercial kitchen they had built in what used to be a storage shed, of the products they created with ingredients they had grown themselves. But what moved Isadora most was the paragraph that described their mission. Desert Bloom Farm operates on the principle that abundance is possible anywhere, but only when people commit to supporting each other's growth. "We're not just growing food," explains founder Isadora Chen Valdez. "We're proving that women who have been discarded by society can create something beautiful together, that the skills we develop in survival can become the foundation for prosperity." The State Agricultural Extension Office asked Isadora to speak at their annual conference about sustainable desert farming and community-supported agriculture. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of farmers and academics and government officials, Isadora thought about the woman who had cowered in a flooded house 10 months ago, too afraid to imagine that survival was possible, much less success. "The secret," she told the audience, her voice carrying clearly across the auditorium, "isn't in the soil or the water or the seeds. It's in refusing to believe that broken things can't be made whole again, that discarded people can't create value, that the end of one story can't become the beginning of something better." The applause was thunderous, but what meant more to Isadora were the individual conversations afterward. Other women who shared their own stories of starting over, farmers who wanted to learn about their techniques, social workers who asked how they might replicate the model in other communities. It was at that reception, surrounded by people wanting to discuss partnerships and expansion opportunities, that she saw him. Garrett stood near the back of the room, wearing a suit she didn't recognize, and watching her with an expression that seemed to combine surprise, resentment, and something that might have been grudging admiration. For a moment, the confident woman she had become disappeared, replaced by the terrified wife who had found that letter in the coffee-scented kitchen of their old life. Her hands began to shake, and she excused herself from the conversation she'd been having, needing to confront this ghost from her past before it could undermine everything she had built. But she didn't run, didn't cower. didn't retreat to the bathroom to compose herself as the old Isadora might have done. Instead, she walked deliberately toward Garrett, her chin raised and her shoulders straight, every step a conscious choice to face her past with the strength she had earned through months of choosing survival over surrender. Isadora. His voice was exactly the same, that familiar baritone that had once whispered endearments and later delivered the cruelest words she had ever heard. But somehow, it seemed smaller than she remembered, less capable of inflicting damage. Garrett. She kept her voice neutral, professional, as if he were any other conference attendee rather than the man who had tried to orchestrate her death. They stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the reception fading into background noise. Garrett's face was thinner than she remembered, his expensive clothes somehow ill-fitting, as if success hadn't quite settled comfortably on his shoulders. There were new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights, and his hands showed the kind of soft neglect that came from not working with them anymore. "You look..." He struggled for words, his composure slipping as he tried to reconcile the confident woman before him with the broken victim he had left behind. "You look successful." "I am." The simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have conveyed. "I heard about what you've built, the business, the women you're helping. It's..." He paused, seemed to be searching for a word that wouldn't acknowledge how completely wrong he had been about her capabilities. "It's impressive. Thank you." She didn't offer false modesty or downplay her accomplishments. The woman she had become had no use for the self-deprecation that the old Isadora had worn like armor. "I wanted to..." Garrett stopped, started again, his confidence continuing to erode as he realized that the script he had prepared for this conversation wasn't going to work. "Things didn't work out the way I thought they would. After I left." Isadora waited, having learned the power of silence, of letting people fill the empty space with their own truths. She noticed that he still couldn't bring himself to say, "after I abandoned you," or "after I tried to get you killed," as if euphemisms could minimize the reality of what he had done. "I've been thinking maybe we could work something out." Garrett continued, his voice gaining strength as he moved into what was clearly a prepared pitch. "A partnership. I could bring capital, business connections, experience with scaling operations. We could really take what you're doing to the next level." The offer that would have devastated her a year ago, the suggestion that she needed his help, that what she had built was somehow incomplete without his involvement, now struck her as almost quaint. Garrett still thought in terms of taking and using, of finding ways to profit from other people's work and pain. "I'm not interested," she said simply, without anger or explanation. "Isadora, be reasonable." His voice took on the edge of irritation that she remembered from their marriage, the tone he used when she failed to be grateful for his condescension. "You could use the help, and I know I made mistakes, but we were good together once. We could be good together again. You left me to die." The words came out calm and clear, without the emotional charge that might have undermined their impact. "You took everything I owned, abandoned me in an isolated location with a serial killer actively hunting women who looked like me, and wrote a message specifically designed to make me believe I deserved it. That wasn't a mistake. That was cruelty, performed with calculation and malice." Garrett's face flushed, the familiar anger surfacing as it always did when he was confronted with consequences he didn't want to accept. "I was desperate. The business was failing. I owed money to people who don't take bankruptcy as an acceptable answer. I didn't have choices." "You had choices." Isadora's voice remained steady, even as she felt the old fear trying to claw its way up from the depths where she had buried it. "You chose cruelty over honesty. You chose to try to destroy me rather than ask for help. You chose to make your problems my emergency and then abandon me to face the consequences alone. I never meant..." You wrote, "Maybe that will solve both our problems about the serial killer," Isadora interrupted, her voice cutting through his attempted justification like a blade. "You didn't just abandon me. You actively tried to get me killed because you thought my death would be convenient for you." The color drained from Garrett's face as he realized that she remembered every word of his letter, that there would be no rewriting history to make his actions seem less monstrous than they had been. "I don't care about your reasons anymore, Garrett. They don't matter. What matters is that I survived and I built something beautiful from the ruins you left behind." She paused, studying his face with the clinical interest of someone examining a specimen under a microscope. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but you won't find it by trying to take pieces of other people's lives." She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at him one more time. "The woman you abandoned in that house died in the flood that first week. What grew in her place doesn't need anything you have to offer." Walking away from him felt like shedding a skin she had outgrown. By the time she reached the reception, hall's exit, she realized that her hands were steady, her breathing was calm, and she was smiling. The confrontation she had dreaded for months had turned out to be nothing more than a conversation with a stranger who happened to share some unpleasant history with someone she used to be. Matthias and Soren were waiting in the parking lot, leaning against Matthias's truck and sharing a bag of cookies from the reception. Soren looked up from his cookie with the kind of serious expression that meant he had been thinking about important things. "How did it go?" Matthias asked, and she could see in his eyes that he knew exactly who she'd been talking to and what it had cost her to face that particular ghost. "It went perfectly," Isadora said, "and meant it. I remembered why I fell in love with who I'm becoming." The wedding took place on a Saturday morning in October, exactly 2 years, after Isadora had planted her first seeds in ground that had been barren for decades. They held the ceremony in the garden she had carved from hostile earth, surrounded by the abundant growth that had started as tiny shoots, watered with equal parts desperation and hope. Rebecca officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion, after Emma pointed out that it would be totally epic to have their chosen family handle every aspect of the celebration. Maria and Emma handled catering, working for weeks to create a menu that featured every product they had developed at Desert Bloom Farm, turning the reception into a showcase of what could be accomplished when people committed to supporting each other's growth. Soren was ring-bearer, approaching his new responsibilities with the same serious attention he brought to irrigation repair and mechanical troubleshooting. He had spent hours practicing his walk down the garden path, determined that nothing would go wrong on what he insisted on calling the most important day in the history of forever. The guest list had grown to include not just the women who lived and worked at Desert Bloom Farm, but customers who had become friends, fellow farmers from around the region, social workers and non-profit organizers who were studying their model for replication elsewhere, and representatives from the State Agricultural Extension Office who had become advocates for their approach to community-supported agriculture. Isadora wore a dress she had designed and sewn herself, using fabric purchased with money she had earned from her own labor. It was simple and practical, cut to allow for movement and dancing, because both were equally important parts of who she had become. The design incorporated elements from Elena's journal, hand-drawn sketches of desert flowers that the original homesteader had included alongside her farming notes. As she and Matthias exchanged vows they had written themselves, Isadora looked out over the assembled crowd and realized that this was what abundance really looked like. Not just the thriving plants and successful business, but the community of people who had chosen to invest in each other's growth rather than compete for limited resources. "I promise," she said to Matthias, her voice carrying clearly across the garden, where she had learned that miracles were just another word for work combined with patience. To tend what we're growing together with the same care I've learned to give the desert, with respect for the hard seasons, with faith that love gets stronger when it's tested, and with the knowledge that the most beautiful things often grow from the most unlikely ground. Matthias's vows were equally rooted in the metaphors that had shaped their courtship. I promise to provide support without trying to control your growth, to share resources without expecting ownership, to celebrate your successes without taking credit, and to weather the inevitable storms with the confidence that what we're building together is stronger than anything that tries to tear it down. Their first kiss as husband and wife tasted like the future, sweet with possibility and seasoned with the knowledge that whatever challenges came, they would face them with the strength that comes from choosing each other every day rather than just once. The celebration lasted until well after dark, with music provided by a mariachi band that Emma had somehow convinced to donate their services in exchange for a year's supply of Desert Bloom Farm's legendary hot sauce. Children who had been born to women staying at the farm played tag between the garden rows, their laughter mixing with adult conversations about expansion plans, new partnerships, and the upcoming visit from a delegation of social workers who wanted to learn about replicating their model in other states. Rebecca had organized a surprise presentation during the reception, a photo timeline showing the transformation of the property from the flooded wreckage Isadora had inherited to the thriving operation it had become. The images were stark in their contrast: the water-damaged house with its collapsed roof, followed by photos of the first tentative garden beds, then the expansion of growing areas, the construction of the commercial kitchen, the arrival of Maria and Rebecca and Emma, and finally the abundant harvest celebrations that had become monthly traditions. "This is what happens," Rebecca said, as the crowd studied the visual evidence of what was possible when people refused to accept that. Broken things couldn't be made whole. When someone decides that survival isn't enough. When they choose to create abundance not just for themselves, but for everyone whose life they touch. Late that night, as the last guests were leaving and the cleanup was finally finished, Isadora found herself standing alone in the garden, where it all began. The moon was full, casting silver light over the rows of plants that would continue growing long after she was gone, their roots extending deep into earth that had learned to remember kindness. She thought about Elena's journal, which had saved her life by proving that other women had found ways to make this harsh land bloom. Somewhere in the house she shared with Matthias and Soren, she had been keeping her own journal, documenting not just the practical details of desert farming, but the larger lessons about resilience and community and the miraculous ability of broken things to become whole again when tended with patience and care. Someday, maybe decades from now, another woman would find that journal. Another woman who needed to learn that survival was possible, that abundance could be coaxed from the most unlikely places, that hope was always the most practical choice available to people who refused to give up on the possibility of growth. The entries she had written told the story of transformation through work and community. October 15th, first seeds in the ground today. Hands are blistered and backaches, but there's something about the promise of growth that makes the pain feel worthwhile. Elena was right. This land remembers kindness. December 3rd. Maria moved into the bunkhouse today. Having someone to share the work and the dreams makes everything feel more possible. We made salsa together and it tasted like friendship. March 22nd. Rebecca and Emma arrived with nothing but courage and determination. The bunkhouse is crowded now, but it feels like family. Emma says we should think of ourselves as refugees from our former lives, founding citizens of whatever comes next. June 8th, First farmers market was terrifying and wonderful, sold out completely and people asked when we'd be back. Matthias says pride looks good on me. Soren says we should add t-shirts to our product line that say, made by women who refuse to give up. September 30th, spoke at the agricultural conference today. Standing at that podium, looking out at all those people who wanted to learn from what we've built, I realized that Victim and Victor aren't opposites. They're different chapters in the same story. Matthias appeared beside her in the garden, his arm settling around her waist with the comfortable weight of partnership freely chosen and daily renewed. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnesses to countless stories of loss and recovery, of endings that became beginnings when people had the courage to keep planting seeds even in hostile ground. Any regrets? He asked softly. Isadora leaned into his warmth and looked out over everything they had built together, not just the thriving farm and successful business, but the community of women who were finding their own strength in this desert sanctuary. The children who would grow up knowing that abundance was possible anywhere people committed to supporting each other's growth. Only one, she said. I wish I could go back and tell that terrified woman in the flooded house that this was all waiting for her, that the worst thing that ever happened to her was also the beginning of the best thing. Desert Bloom Farm would eventually expand to include a dozen women and their children, a certified organic operation that supplied restaurants across the Southwest, and a non-profit organization that provided temporary housing and job training for women escaping domestic violence. Isadora would speak at conferences around the country, sharing both the practical and philosophical lessons of desert farming with anyone willing to listen. The model they developed, combining sustainable agriculture with community support for women in transition, would be replicated in 17 states, creating a network of farms that proved abundance was possible anywhere people committed to growing something beautiful together. But the real legacy wasn't in the business success or the recognition or even the women whose lives were changed. By finding a place where their worth was measured by their willingness to work rather than their past mistakes. It was in the proof that no matter how completely someone might try to destroy you, they could never touch your capacity to create. Something beautiful from the rubble they left behind. The desert remembered kindness. And kindness, Isadora had learned, was just another word for refusing to give up on the possibility that broken things could grow into something stronger and more beautiful than they had ever been before the breaking occurred. In the end, her greatest victory wasn't surviving Garrett's cruelty or building a successful business or even finding love again. It was the knowledge that she had transformed from someone who needed saving into someone who could save others, from someone who consumed hope into someone who created it, from someone who feared the future into someone who planted seeds for generations not yet born. The journal she kept for future women would end with this entry. October 15th, 3rd anniversary of planting the first seeds. Soren is now 11 and designing irrigation systems that would impress engineers. Emma started college on a scholarship but comes back every weekend to help with the farmers market. Maria opened her own restaurant in town featuring our ingredients. Rebecca is writing a book about community-supported agriculture as a tool for social justice. The land that once seemed determined to kill me now feeds dozens of families. The house that was falling down around me now echoes with laughter and planning sessions and children's voices. The woman who was abandoned to die alone is now surrounded by a chosen family that grows stronger with each passing season. If you are reading this because you found it in dark times, know this. The ground you're standing on, no matter how hostile it seems, can be transformed into something that sustains not just you, but everyone whose life you touch. The only requirement is refusing to believe that broken things can't be made whole. Plant something. Water, Wait, trust the process. The desert remembers kindness.